So we're now going to move into our keynote speakers as the first of our keynote speakers. And we've got two amazing speakers who are going to bring really different but complementary perspectives around global to local innovations in Landcare. I had the opportunity to speak with both of them last night, and I'm very excited about what we're going to hear. So Keith, if you'd like to come and stand alongside me while I introduce you, that'd be great. So Keith Bradby is the CEO Gondwana. Thank you. Gondwana Link in Western Australia. He's a long-time advocate for ecological values of southwestern Australia. His day-to-day work involves large-scale ecological restoration, supporting the work of numerous groups over a 1,000-kilometre long link, chasing the that's a long link, chasing the large amounts of money needed, collaborating with other large connectivity initiatives, and chairing the Western Australian Landcare Network. He's written one book, numerous articles and papers, and in January 2015 was awarded an Order of the Australian Medal for services to conservation and environment in Western Australia. An interesting fact about Keith is that at one time he was Central Victoria's only combined chimney sweeper and grave digger.
Another one is he uses a left-hand mouse and he's just confusing himself. But I'll get there.
We'll sort you in a minute. We'll sort you. In his spare time, he sleeps. So whilst we just set this up, can you please join me in welcoming Keith?
Right. Thanks, Leanne. I generally like talking later in a conference because I can get a feel of what you really wanted to hear, and I can also build on what others done. But it's the first time I've had nearly everything I wanted to say done by a primary school. It was pretty impressive. So that's the title I gave myself, or Jerry gave me some months ago, and I wrote an abstract, and now I'll talk to something else. But I did two things I wanted to say was that I'm not going to do a nuts and bolts on this. It's more about what's the big framework, what's the big overview that we need to help innovation and a diverse movement happen. And the second thing is, everything I hear about you South Australians says you are really, really good at collaborating together, and I don't think the rest of the country is. So, well done. But the bad news is, we're in trouble. You know, 30 years of Landcare, and we actually haven't made a substantial difference. And the world is in trouble. The scientific reality is we are moving out of the Holocene, that nice, gentle period in the Earth's climate history where us evolved and grew to be what we call a civilised society. It's going to change. It's going to change drastically. It is changing. We also need to feed 10 billion people by 2060. And we're going to have to do that in a climate-constrained world with all the disruption to our normal systems that climate change will bring. Now that means, and here's the fundamental blunt message, that if you're not doing something fundamentally transformative in your work, you might not be going to make much of a difference from now on. So it's a crushing, all this time building this wonderful movement, doing this great stuff, oh bugger, it's not enough. That's where we are. I thought I'd better very quickly throw in a couple of the definitions of what Landcare is, because it's a very diverse movement. I'm pulling from the International Landcare Guiding Values, but I also grabbed a little snippet from the late 90s from a couple of academics who went around and talked to a whole heap of Landcare groups about what they thought Landcare was, and I like it. Many of the characteristics attributed to new social movements, and I'm going to make a bit of a distinction between movements and organisations in this talk. People involved in Landcare typically express a commitment to participatory forms of action and coordination, believe in win-win approaches to conflict, and are opposed to government telling them what to do. That's apparently where we were in the late 90s. Now we're just going to do a bit of a quick travel, and I know it's got to be quickly, Anne. I was privileged last year to spend a bit of time in Zambia helping the African Landcare movement. One of the, Minister Frydenberg recognised it, one of the many Landcare movements around the world who have grown from the Australian Landcare movement. There's an African Landcare network that involves, I think, 10 or 11 countries. It's well looked after by the International Secretariat, which is based in Nairobi and is part of the South African development community. And I didn't know what to expect from being lumped in with that crew. First thing, I looked at the program and saw we had farmers there, we had regional bureaucrats, we had national bureaucrats, and we had global administrators, bureaucrats. And I thought, well, that's never going to work. But it did. And I think one of the failings we've got to think about in Australia is that how we get those different levels to work better together. The other thing that surprised me, well, I guess that's the image of Africa I had. You know, it's in trouble. It is in trouble as a country, and it has shocking things happening. And I borrowed these slides from the old codger in the corner of this presentation, Dennis Garrity, who is the chair of International Landcare. That's the picture a lot of us get of a country in real trouble. That's the same place now. There has been some phenomenally impressive change happening at very large scale across Africa. They have really bent their elbow to the wheel of how do you fundamentally change landscapes. I saw agroforestry at scales I've never even dreamt of in Australia. And in this example up on the screen, they're growing an extra 600 to 800 kilogram of maize per hectare through the use of what used to be called acacias and grow your own fertiliser approaches. Africa now has a continental goal of 100 million hectares of restoration by 2030. It's the sort of zeros I like to hear. And I was there to help them develop a 5 million hectare proposal. Don't do that much in Australia. Of their 100 million hectare overall commitment, this is what the southern African countries have already committed to. These are countries who don't have a lot of spare cash, who have a whole heap of pressing social issues. 350 million people in Africa live on less than $1 a day. And it's something like 60% of the population's under 35, a bit different from here. But those countries are working towards those commitments. And Malawi, I did a bit with Total Landcare, they're already 30% of the way there. I just want to make one fundamental point. Makes our 20 million tree program look pretty puny, doesn't it? I don't quite understand how the Africans are doing so well at this. I hope to get better things, but here's a few insights I saw, which I think keen to dwell on more. They do have that ambition and vision at the highest levels, but it does build on on-ground techniques that are very adoptable. And I didn't see an awful lot of the middle layer. They seem to be able to go from, yep, this works, let's do lots of it, bang, national support. It is a collective effort. We had people there whose countries had been at war with each other in recent years, but they can still sit around the table. Focus is on the goal, not the mechanisms, and there is substantial external funding available, but I make the point that Africa needs it. They're not a rich Western country like ours. We should be able to do this with our own resources. And there's a degree of, people got up at the end of this, the main planning session, farmers, and gave their commitment to achieve the goals they'd set themselves because they were necessary. And then one left the stage and said, I hope it works, my family starves otherwise. Wow. So next time someone says to me, you can't be green if you're in the red, I'm not going to listen to them. Right. I never got to meet any of the Maasai guys, but I've got some very close friends who work closely with both the Maasai tribes people and the ranchers of southern Arizona. And they've actually brought them together about 8-9 years ago. It's been a useful exchange. The Maasai have managed Now, they've got something in common, by the way, cattle. The Maasai have managed very large areas for a very long time without tenure, and were able to show that world to the Southern Arizona ranchers, who really struggled with the fact that this big landscape of theirs was broken into square blocks, and it works as a big landscape, as all landscapes do. And the group in Arizona is the Malpai Borderlands Group. Malpai means Badlands. This is the country where Geronimo made his last stand. And that fellow, I've had the pleasure of a bit of time with Warner Glenn, that cowboy, and he is a cowboy. Warner and his wife Wendy, who are part of this Malpai group. Not got time to go into detail, but they've got the sort of objectives a lot of your rangelands groups would have, and they work at similar scales. But the big difference is, being in America, people write books about how they're going and study them intensively, whereas here we just tend to glide on. And this is more words than you meant to put on a PowerPoint slide, but these were really, really profound for me. This is a guy who worked there for 15 years and also worked with the main fisheries, and has also worked with the Maasai. Charles Curtin, The Science of Open Spaces, I recommend it. He talks about the need to take the local effort and the local politics, which often needs a bit of a breaker, and if you're going to go up to scale, you need what he calls the honest broker, the people who can help it come together and transcend the local small town issues, but respect the small town values. And he also writes about how it's really hard for NGOs to do that, because they tend to get drawn into doing their own projects and running their own organisations. And I think we do have a challenge, certainly in Western Australia, probably not here, between organisations whose primary goal is the strength of the organisation, and organisations whose primary goal is the health of the landscape. And I'm not sure if that makes sense. I'm here to argue it for a couple of days if you like, but I think it is a divide we need to bear in mind. Speeding up now. Let's go to New Zealand. And I've had the pleasure the last 5 or 6 years of giving a bit of advice and support to a group looking at fundamental change across all of New Zealand north of Auckland. There's a picture of a crafty old codger who's one of the funders, Trevor Gray. The last 5 or 10 years I've been working on the theory that between everything great that's happening, there's a crafty old codger who needs to be well paid and fed. And this is a planning session we did for these guys. But I want to use some slides of Trevor's to give the funders' perspective. Trevor, when I first met him, was General Manager of the Tyndall Foundation, which is one of the larger philanthropic groups in New Zealand, and they'd funded lots of projects and done lots of great stuff and come to the conclusion it wasn't making much difference. So they wrestled with how do you go from that as a funder. But he did point out projects, which is what most of us do. I spent 30 years filling in 12-month funding applications. I'm a bit over it. But projects have a lot of appeal. But Trevor has very consciously moved his organisations to what he calls big, hairy, green goals. What are the big things we really need to do that bring stuff together? And he acknowledges that they're much harder for funders, much harder for everyone. And there's some of the issues that he's had to deal with. What Trevor has done to enable the Reconnecting Northland program to get up, he has, as a funder, has brought the other funders together in a cooperative way. In all our time in Landcare, we've been pushed to collaborate, to integrate, to work together, and we've been pushed to do that in a funding environment that selects for competitiveness. And that, to me, is a big change we need to make. And Trevor has done that. And this is the 5-year meeting of the Reconnecting Northland program, which he is in the process of handing over to the local community as a going concern, with the two biggest foundations in New Zealand underwriting their program costs and hunting for the project money. And I should say the key drivers in this, they've done a lot of it through the World Wildlife Foundation guys in New Zealand. There's 3 of them in this photo. I never once heard them call themselves WWF. All the time I worked with them, they called themselves RN, and I think they transcended that organisational imperative. Egypt, now there's a wonderful country. Never been there. But I do bump into these things a lot in Australia, these old Egyptian pyramids. And I think we've really got to do a bit better. This is not the operational model for Landcare. And yet I keep feeling we're being squeezed into this narrowing where someone can say what's going to happen and we'll dutifully carry it out. The Maori have a much better model, which they've explained to me. The shark tooth, it works better when there's lots of them aligned together. The cutting bit is actually all the little bits along the side. And it was pointed out to me that, sure, the point's really important, but the point of the point is to feed the rest of the body, not to command the rest of the body. And if the point goes a bit rotten, well, it can flake off and you'll have another point. I like that way of looking at that. My own program in Western Australia started with a friendship and a few beers. I think that should be compulsory. And it has been part of a fundamental change in Australia. This photo is, without question, about 18 years ago. At that stage, environmental philanthropy in Australia barely existed. Bush Heritage Australia, 2 part-time staff. Australian Wildlife Conservancy, 1 full-time, 1 part-time staff. Now those sort of organisations and lots of others have grown enormously, and I know Bush Heritage and AWC would be up at 80 or 90 staff. This is Peg Olsen from the Nature Conservancy, who came to Australia and has been a big help and encouraged us to get up this program. I'm not going to go into detail with that program, but Andrew from Wild Air and I are going to sit in a corner and compare notes on large-scale programs. Look, we've done lots of great stuff, and I can talk about 15,000 hectares of this bought and excellent. And I'll show just a couple of quick things, but the one big success I know from this program is that people get it, and they get that it is a bold and ambitious and almost unreachable vision that people understand, and it inspires people. And in terms of achieving innovation, it has brought innovators to us. You know, within a couple of months of launching the program, I had a phone call, not a knock on the door, a phone call, from a fellow who said, we were thinking of doing this, we got X hundred grand, can we do it down there? And that sort of stuff, with a bit of footwork on our part, has multiplied. And I was asking people last night, what's a big bold vision for South Australia? And I'm not hearing one yet. It does involve a diversity of groups, from local Landcare groups to global groups, working together. No hierarchy either. And they don't even have to get together and plan it all out. These guys might only meet themselves every couple of years, whether they need to or not. And there's 2 of us at the core who sort of oil the wheels between everybody. And I had to make I wanted to make one very specific point about innovation, and that's it. We, in the central bit of Gondwana, where we are trying to restore farmland similar to what you guys are doing, the guy who has given us rocket fuel is this fella. He did the carbon allometrics that brought in millions of dollars. He worked out how to do 40 or 50 hectares a day, direct seeding with about 120 species. He's been kicked out of most of the organisations he works for. Innovators are often really difficult people. So let's not try and homogenise our movement too much. This is one section of the central bit of the link. Yes, we are actually buying back, raising private funds, buying back whole farms and revegetating whole farms. Why? Well, a lot of them are pretty marginal anyway, and probably they're crappy soil types that shouldn't have been opened up. Number two, they are strategically placed ecologically to do an awful lot of good when this happens. So this is not a, let's plant trees here, here, here and have 15 dots on a map. This is how do you place things. How do you put your agroforestry plantings in the upper catchment? How do you put your ecological plantings where you need it? How do you bring in a whole heap of social activity around that work so that the community feels better off? That's the sort of strategic stuff we need to do more of, I think. And it's a big week for me. I wanted to boast about one of our programs. And I'm not sure if the Naju guys or any of your traditional owner programs would consider themselves Landcare. I see enough faces here, they obviously do. But we've got this big 16 million hectare bit of bush on the edge of the wheat belt, which had been ignored in WA. We've promoted it, we documented its poorly known scientific values. It's now recognised as the largest remaining temperate woodland in the world. And I think we've all got gems like that in southern Australia that aren't recognised. We've had a long-standing relationship with the Naju people. Governments of Australia fought them in court for 18 years before they got their exclusive native title, and then government left them alone. So we've stepped into that and helped them build their ranger programs, just as you have a lot of wonderful ranger programs in South Australia. We've helped them do their 50-year conservation plan. It all goes back to a meeting in January 2013 where we said, oh, we don't like doing stuff on the ground, we'd rather you did it, but if you haven't got the capacity, we'll help, and then we'll hand it over. And next week, we're handing over $1 million+ program and lots of ute and a couple of utes and heaps of equipment and so on. And I think for large-scale stuff, there's elements in that are really important in how we should be operating. We are sacrificing our organisation to help the people on the ground build their geographic program. And I also add, the lady in the middle who made this so pivotal from Rangelands NRM in WA at the time was Jane Bradley from the Mount Lofties. Right, nearly done, Leanne, don't panic. I really had trouble thinking through how to can see important elements in all those threads, and I said to Jerry, I'll hang around for 2 days, and people who want the nuts and bolts conversations I'm really keen to explore with them how you do things, because I don't have the answers for you. But I think it's really important, if we're thinking big, think about the bloody nonsense that's happened with climate change politics in Australia. So as the problems get worse and more apparent and more scientifically documented, the opposition to making change has got worse as well. We've spent probably 20 years now trying to devise centralised solutions to how to tackle climate change, and we haven't made a lot of progress. But it's the commercial and local uptake of innovative fixes that has been phenomenally rapid. And anyone who's flown into any city and looked down at all the rooftops with all the photovoltaic panels. The Paris Climate Accord from, is it now 18 months ago, only happened because businesses and local governments and city mayors from around the world united and made it happen. It wasn't national governments. So there's some fundamental changes in how things happen. Have I got a few take-home messages? Tick that one. Got that one. Good. Well, here's one on my notepad here. I had to check it again this morning. Thank goodness the Wentworth group of scientists have done an estimation. I come from the building industry. You've got a problem, you work out what it costs to fix it and you go there. 160 billion by 2050 will sort out this country's landscape, environmental, land care issues. That's 0.3% of GDP per annum, and we're squabbling a bit and competing with each other and worrying about pretty small amounts of money currently available to us. I do want to add that there are businesses in Australia having $100+ million conversations about how to invest in better land management, and preparing yourself and positioning yourself into those conversations is where I think we need to go. So, important to set yourself some goals that are really scary, which is what we did 16 years ago, and we're still here and still doing it and still growing. Gee, I've seen a lot of money spent on strategies. Now, to quote Mark Anderson, ex-Greening Australia, South Australia, if you can't print it on a tea towel, it's not strategic. So we started with 4 strategic goals in our program. 15 years later, we've added a couple more, but we're meeting them. And I think just having a simple game plan beats a lot of the more complex stuff I've seen. Focus on the limiting factors. In Central Gondwana Link, it actually wasn't all the things people were doing. It was actually access to large lumps of land, which was where we focused. I'm being rude to Landcare and to government by saying we have become welfare dependent, and it's more and more like working in Centrelink. I think this constant focus on, so what's the minister's program going to look like, and do you think if we devised and changed and did that, we could fit? That I think is killing us. We've chosen to, most of the breakthrough stuff we've done with private money, mainly philanthropic. It's not an easy place to get to, but staying where a lot of us are, and you know, Barnaby Joyce sneezes, we all catch pneumonia. That is not the way to run a country. Cast your net wide. We've funded one property through keeping our kids out of jail. I've done a water monitoring program through the Office of Women's Interests, lots of stuff. And I think my last one there, do not try and evaluate Landcare through how we think about organisations. It is a movement, and the only stuff that's going to move fast enough to make a difference is, you know, the power of social the power of communities when they get really going. I said in the abstract, how do you retain the warmth? Well, it is about focusing on place and people. It is working through honest brokers, not competitors, and knowing the difference. And there is, let's not pretend there isn't a lot of competition in our world. And last critical point, it is about land care. You know, I come from Perth, you know, the other country, the one that's going to, I think we're bringing the Kimberley water down the border now and then sending it across, and you'll all need visas. But if you walk around Perth and say to people, I work in natural resource management, they say, oh really? Which company? Which mining company? You know, I have never been comfortable with calling ourselves a natural resource management sector. Number one, every acronym is a turgid thing that does not inspire. I think we've created great confusion in the broader community about who we are, and we're getting lots of duplicating stuff. And I think we've got to go back to the fact that what drives people here is they care about the future of the place we live in. There's another fundamental ingredient to making a big difference, which comes with a caution. Thank you.